what's the difference between strategy RPG and turn-based RPG? A turn-based, you don't move on grids, there's little strategy involved. Most of your characters cannot move, they're just sitting there, or they can move just a little in limited areas. Strategy RPGs, you have large areas to move around to, terrain affected areas most of the time. And what's the word? Well, in some of them, like I mentioned, you get this grid base, you can move on grid, so your character's movement is very limited or largely limited, you have these range to move around, and it just requires way more strategy to come up with your actions, because these actions depend most of the time on several characters that are fighting in the field, than in just 3 or 4, which we usually see on regular turn-based RPGs. That's a major difference. That's an interesting topic, the difference between strategy RPGs and turn-based RPGs. That's pretty simple, but it goes deeper. There are some hybrid JRPGs that are they can be considered as both. And because they add a little bit of strategy. I can think of the Trails series, for example, where characters can move around and position themselves to avoid attacks or to execute better attacks, for example. And there's also more strategic moves, like in the Xenoblade Chronicles, for example. You have to move around to the side to execute this side attack, or to the back for this other attack, this back attack, or you need to break the enemy first and then topple and then daze to get massive damage and to execute a proper combo. So there's always strategy involved in all types of video games, even in regular action RPGs. But when it comes to the main difference between strategy and turn-based is what I just explained, that strategy is more about planning carefully what you're gonna do for a long period of time. In turn-based RPGs, the majority of the battles that are long are the boss battles. Regular enemies, you are done within a few minutes. And in a strategy RPG, you don't get random encounters per se, You have a whole map to clear, and your enemies can move around the whole area. Like I mentioned, usually a terrain-affected area, to complete a map, a battle that it definitely takes at the very least 10 to 15 minutes maybe, So it's more about the strategy and how you use all of your characters, because in most strategy RPGs you get a bunch of characters, not just 4 or 5. There are strategy RPGs in which you can only choose 1 or 2 or 3 characters. Monarch is one of them. There's only 4 characters in there, max. And then this the first Arc the Lad, you only control 4 characters, I think. But the majority of strategy RPGs, you have a large cast of characters at your command, and you need to know how to move them around and do this and that with these characters, and so on. You're basically playing in strategy RPGs an overworld with random encounters. And the difference is that you can see the enemies, and you have a limited amount of a limited movement range, to approach that enemy and get into a battle that usually ends up quickly in a few seconds. So that's the huge difference, There's just a lot of strategy involved, and that's why they're called strategy RPGs. Yeah, but I guess you're also asking because most strategy RPGs are turn-based. Every character has their own turn. So that's why a lot of people call them turn-based strategy, because there's a lot of games that are strategy games, but they're not turn-based. You know how they call those? They call them real-time strategy. When your characters do not have to wait for a turn to execute their actions, to move around or to fight. A perfect example of that is Grow Lancer. The Grow Lancer series are real-time strategy RPGs. But usually the majority of strategy RPGs are turn-based strategy RPGs. It's not that confusing. It's a little bit, but not really, It's just not really. Just pay attention, Focus on the terrain on the maps, Turn-based RPGs don't have maps to complete. They're just a really shrunk down small area where you fight. And in the majority of regular turn-based RPGs, you just stay still. Your characters do not move. You just select their turns and they go. Your party members are here, the enemy is here. You select them, the direction in their menu, they go, punch the enemy, and that's it. Right? They don't move. And in strategy RPGs, you gotta direct your characters, to select this destination and they move, right? They fight in maps. That's the difference between a strategy RPG and a turn-based RPG. The layout the place they fight in.